Not doing
Go on. Yeah. You got.
It's going to be real awkward on the intro. Nobody's even going to know what they're listening to.
You're going to have to stop it.
No.
No way are you going to leave all of that.
There's a way.
Betty's like, bet.
Welcome to the AfterWord. Thank you for listening. I'm joined by Vince, by Kirsten, by Betty. The goal of this podcast is to look at the passage that was just preached. We're going to ask questions of it, hopefully apply it well. I don't know if we'll have all the answers, but we're going to ask some more questions of it. We want to see God's glory in it. Before we get going through all of that, though, here's a warming up, get to know us sort of intro question provided to us by Betty. What is a prominent summer memory from childhood?
I thought it was core summer memory.
I changed the word to prominent.
Oh. Do you want to talk through that?
I was just more of a power play, really.
Was my question not good enough for you, Eric?
I think you need to leave the intro in, okay?
I will.
You changed your question.
What's a prominent / core summer memory from childhood?
I have a few that come to mind. One that I enjoyed and one that I didn't enjoy. My mom would make us have an hour of quiet time in our room every day during the summer, and we had to do some sort of like handwork. Like I remember doing
a craft.
Yeah, it was, and I hate crafts, but like I had to do this like thing where you'd like push this needle through like a thing.
Oh yeah, the yarn. No, the yarn, and it made like a pillow.
Yeah, it wasn't cross stitch, but and then you would pull it back through, and it would make like a fuzzy pillow, like a rainbow.
Oh yeah.
Anybody with me?
No clue.
Oh
Yeah, I'll have to find it. And I hated it, but I had to do it every day during the summer.
Did it bring you closer to Jesus?
It did not.
What was the picture?
A rainbow. So there was a heart involved too, I think. That was not a happy core memory. But as a mom now, I'm like, I get it. Like she just needed an hour of quiet and sanity. So I get it. Another core memory is I grew up in Missouri, and we used to go on float trips for the day. We had a canoe.
Describe a float trip.
We had a canoe. It was me and my two sisters and my parents, and usually my dog in one canoe. And my dad would sit in the back. My mom would sit in the front with the dog between her knees. Mm-hmm. And then my sisters and I would sit on the floor of the canoe. And we would like float like the Black River, the Snake River in Missouri. And like we'd take a cooler. And it was an ordeal. But we went for the whole day. And I hated driving there. I felt like it was like 8 hours away. But it was probably like an hour. And we would float the whole day, play in the river. Have lunch, and then I remember catching minnows in my shoes, because in Missouri you wear like tennis shoes in the river. Nobody had chacos or river sandals.
Maybe not just Missouri, but maybe the time of
I don't know. I think it's just Missouri. I think that's just what people in Missouri do. Anyway, that was a core memory.
The floating sounds like fun.
Yeah, that's what they call it in Missouri, a float trip, because the rivers aren't like here.
Yeah.
So a float trip means any thing that you can get on or in and just float down the river, because they're pretty slow.
It's very calm.
Yeah.
There's not, I mean, you hardly need to paddle, but you just kind of go with the current. But you can also just play in the river because it's nice and slow, and it's not super cold.
Float trip was a different way of saying, do you want to go drinking this weekend? And
we didn't do that.
No, not your family.
Not my family, no.
Yeah. We're going on a float trip. Yeah.
Vince, do you have?
I don't. Come around to me. I'm still thinking.
Betty, what's yours?
I have a couple as well. This is like a whole summer, but one summer, my friend and I, almost every day, we would go drive her golf cart around town, like during the day, and then at night we would go home and play Minecraft. And we did that every single day for a summer. And I feel like that's like core summer memory. There's a lot of songs that like I listen to now, and they remind me of the golf cart. So
name one.
That's fun. If I Lose Myself by One Republic. So anyway.
How's that go again?
Doesn't anymore.
Yep.
Doesn't go.
We'll move on. And then, the other one is I used to go to my aunt and uncle's for like a week out of the summer, and they live in Denver, and we would always go to like Elitch's and like the Museum of Nature and Science. And I've been to both of those recently, so it brought back all of these childhood memories.
I had a friend that we both had rabbits as pets, and we used to ride around on our bikes with our rabbits in our backpack. And then we watched Back to the Future every day during the summer.
So that
great.
was
What about that sounds great?
Rabbits.
Okay. Do you have one yet, Eric?
I have a lot of memories. Mowing the lawn on really hot, humid days. But he doesn't like that answer. My dad grew up on a farm, so my uncle would still grow sweet corn on that farm that he would give to family members. And so I have memories of early in the morning, mom is boiling the corn, and we would like cut it so we could freeze it. But you start early in the morning because it's so blasted hot with all that boiling and the hot air and everything. And that probably was only 1 or 2 days of summer, but I distinctly remember that. And that corn was the best corn I've had in my life. So if you want good sweet corn, I guess go to Iowa.
All right.
There's a little plug for Iowa for you.
Eric's on the marketing
For the
team
sweet
of
corn
Iowa.
connoisseurs out there.
So good.
My memories of growing up in the summer were being on my bike, going anywhere and everywhere, to friends' houses. I remember now as I think about it, I'm like, my parents let me go to a lot of different places on my bike that I'd probably never let my kids go. Not
It was
like
a different time,
not
though,
the
too.
shady places. I just mean like, hey, we're going to my friend's house, and then we'd be gone for hours, like out, and they had no idea. But I was riding my bike with my friend to his house, kind of through a field, through some woods. I went over this little dirt ramp, flipped over backwards, landed on my head, no helmets at the time, split my head open. I don't remember if they took me, his parents took me to the hospital, or if my parents came and got me. Either way, I had to get stitches, but I was covered in blood by that point. I had to get stitches in my head. I remember my dad taking me home, so he must have either taken me there or come to the hospital to get me. I forget. Taking me home, I was sitting in the car, and I remember him saying, "Oh, it smells like dead chickens," because he used to butcher chickens when he grew up on the farm, and I just had blood. I was covered in blood, completely covered in blood.
That's just your son's blood.
He's like, "It smells like dead chickens."
Yeah. That's a good summer memory.
That's a good summer memory.
How about 1 Corinthians 11?
Yeah, speaking of blood and bread and wine. 1 Corinthians 11, remember 11 through 14 are instructions to the church about the gathering of the church. And so Paul moves from head coverings, which is a part of what we looked at last week and how that plays out. If you didn't look into that, I would encourage you to listen to that one and the AfterWord as well. But moves into now the Lord's Supper, at least a beginning instruction about unity in the church and how and why they gather and how it's all to be directed to Jesus. So the first correction that Paul brings, he says, I can't commend you for what you're doing as you gather. Come together, by the way, that phrase come together is in there 5 times in this passage, 5 times. So it's a big part of what Paul's getting at. This coming together is what the instruction is. So he says, I can't commend you when you come together because what you're doing is creating division among you by elitism or classes of people. Likely what was happening is the wealthy people who had time and a lot of free time or a lot of time to be able to do different things that other more manual laboring kinds of families didn't have the time to do. They would gather early and begin eating, drinking, feasting before the other people of the church were gathering in the homes. And so what was likely going on is that some class systems were being worked out in the church. And so Paul is bringing correction to that. It's not, this isn't bringing unity. So he's correcting their division. And really the thrust of it is, and he even says this, what you're doing is not, what you're celebrating is not the Lord's Supper. You're having supper, but it's not the Lord's Supper. So his push is toward the Lord's Supper. When you get together, celebrate all that Christ has done and what he's accomplished on the cross. That's where he's commending the people to go. And then from there, he moves straight into quoting, mostly quoting directly from the gospel accounts, what Jesus says in that upper room on the night of Passover before he's crucified. He quotes the words of Jesus in his commending the disciples to remember him through the breaking of bread and the sharing of wine. And so he walks through that kind of word by word from what he has heard from Jesus. And then from that moves into some pretty hard correction and instruction about just some warnings about what happens when the Lord's Supper is taken in an unworthy manner or in a way that's not focusing on what Christ has accomplished for the church in his death. And then some instructions with that. We'll get into that, but that's how it goes. So that's the passage. It begins with, I can't commend you. Here's what's going on. Here's the cultural context. Here's the words from Jesus about the Lord's Supper. Here's the big warnings and instruction on that.
Yeah, so I think I want to start here. You hit on this yesterday, but let's do this one more time.
Yeah.
These are probably the most confusing pieces of this passage when Paul talks about don't take communion in an unworthy manner.
Yeah.
And then when he also says, essentially, because you've been doing that, that's why some of you are sick and dying. So hit on that one more time.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, in the whole flow of the passage, the unworthy manner is in a way that doesn't take into consideration the what Christ has accomplished on the cross. And so the warnings for that. Sorry, my phone died, and that was the Bible I was using. So I'm trying to figure this out here. So right after the quote from Jesus about here's what this is, here's what the meal means, here's what the bread is, here's what the cup is, and the command from Jesus to celebrate that. Right after that, he says, if you eat or drink in an unworthy manner, he's pushing that back to the unworthy manner is not considering what Jesus has done in the sacrifice of the cross. So I think often what we have assumed in the church is, or at least this is what I grew up with. I'd love to hear from you all. Hearing that passage, I think, I've got to have had my act together, or I've got to have had a good week where I haven't sinned a lot, or whatever. I've got to have been a kind person even this morning as I've walked into the church gathering. It's that sort of thing. And if I have not done those things, I would be taking the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. And I don't think that's what Paul's pushing at. I think he's pushing toward, is your remembrance of this meal that you're taking actually about all that Christ has accomplished in the giving of his life and the breaking of his body and the shedding of his blood? Is that the focus of what you're doing in this meal? If not, you're doing it in an unworthy manner. So from there, did that make sense? Any questions around that?
In my own words, if I'm understanding right, unworthy manner is some of the revelry that he was talking about was happening.
At least in part, I think.
Yeah, drunkenness, someone not going hungry, the classes, at least in part. Taking it in a worthy manner is remembering what Jesus did through all of it.
And as a part of that, I mean, I think we have to read between the lines, right? I really do think what part of what Paul is saying is the ways in which you have been acting have not exhibited who Christ is and what he came to accomplish in his sacrificial love. The kind of love you're displaying is not sacrificial at all. In fact, you're not sacrificing anything. You're going ahead and eating and drinking without other people being here. You're creating this class system elitism. That's not the sacrificial, humble love of Christ. So in that way, you're disregarding all that Christ is about in the giving of his life and the shedding of his blood. And in taking the Lord's Supper, you're actually doing it in a way that discounts and disregards what Christ has done because you're living in a completely different way.
How does that apply, though? Like on a Sunday morning, I think I felt a sense of conviction yesterday of the number of times, probably over the course of my life, that I've taken it in an unworthy manner and that I've just been distracted during the service, not paying attention, or my mind is going 1,000 different directions, and it's just routine. It's just what we do. And so, I mean, I spent a good portion of my time in prayer yesterday just asking God to forgive me for all the times that I have taken it in an unworthy manner. And so, I don't know. I don't know if I have a question with that, but just this sense of like, I think I don't imagine I'm alone in this, and just this realization of like, man, I think I've probably done that a lot.
Yeah.
And so outside of repentance and then moving forward, trying to make sure that my heart is in a good place. Like, how would you counsel someone who's maybe in a similar place that I am?
Well, I think I don't think there's a formula. And so I think that if you keep reading, verse 28, 27 is about not eating in an unworthy manner. Verse 28 is the very next command is to let a person examine himself. Then, so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. So I think there's a process of examining your heart and examining yourself in a way that would redirect. So I think your response yesterday, spending a lot of time in prayer, is the exact response that is needed, of examining your heart. Where have I not done this? Where can I now focus my attention on Christ and all that he's accomplished? Because the very next verse is, for anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. So some have read that to say without discerning the body of Christ, like the church body. But based on everything else around it, I'd take it literally. So anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body of Christ, the actual physical body of Christ, without considering or thinking about what Christ has accomplished, eats and drinks judgment on himself. And so I think there's a moment, and we try to do this as a church, and I want to push into this more and more in the weeks to come, to give some space to actually pause and consider what Christ has accomplished. And we want to give space for that to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think another question or thing I wrestled with yesterday was just as a parent, what's my duty and responsibility? Because I mean, I was saying before the podcast, like I've had times that my boys have sat with friends and like they've just goofed off. They've been a distraction. You know, they draw pictures and try to make the other person laugh, and then the other person's trying not to laugh, you know, and then they've gone and taken communion. And so I think my tendency is to create laws and to follow rules. And so I feel a little bit of like almost paralyzation of like, I don't want to put the weightiness on my kids of, oh, you didn't pay attention well enough today. You were a distraction. You weren't good enough. So you don't get to take communion. And yet there's also a weightiness as a parent of actually my kids need to understand just the weight of what they're doing and what they're participating in. And so I think, you know, I have one kid who tends to fall asleep a lot. Not that you're boring, but it's just, you know, I think it's hot and it's this kid. And, you know, and so I had to have some conversations with him yesterday about, you know, if you're falling asleep during the sermon, I'm not sure you're engaging that well. And we need to have some conversations about communion. But, you know, again, I think my legalistic heart is always drawn towards like rules. And so you don't fall asleep, you get to take communion, or you're not a distraction, you get to take communion. But I don't think those rules are helpful for my kids necessarily. So as a parent, like, how do we navigate that, you know, especially with kids in all different ages and maturities and readiness? Like, yeah. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. I can speak from my ignorance and what is coming to mind. And as I've thought about this, I think you did say something based on maturity. I think we have to gauge based on the maturity of the child who has professed faith. So that has to be known, right? Some sort of profession of faith, as much as we can determine from our kids, they have professed a faith in Jesus. But, you know, a 7-year-old professing faith in Jesus looks very different than a 16-year-old professing faith in Jesus, and their ability to understand, comprehend, and also pay attention without squirming and with, you know, all of that. So I think we have to know our kids well enough to know how they navigate all of those things. And just like the command on us from Paul is not, you must sit still and have your mind on what Jesus has done the entire flow of the gathering. But there's a point at which he says, so examine yourself. And I think that's the instruction I would give to kids too. And I think I saw this yesterday. At least I saw some parents pausing during communion to sort of lean over and talk to their children. And so I think it's a matter of of just having that quick conversation of preparing. And it's not just on a Sunday morning, it's preparing before Sunday morning. It's preparing Saturday and thinking about what Christ has done. And do we understand that? And do we comprehend that? And are we moving into that direction? It's okay to have a quick conversation. I think, and we'll talk more about this, but I think that's some of the beauty of having the space as people are walking up, taking the elements, to have that space to be able to talk as families to our kids and consider some of those things. And like I said yesterday, because our belief as a church is not that communion saves you or is some like magical potion that will do something for you, the harm of saying, hey, why don't you not do that today, is not detrimental to the person's well-being. In fact, it may be way better to say, why don't you pause today and not take, and let's talk more about that. That's from my perspective, that's way better than go ahead and take it and we'll talk about this some other time. It at least brings to mind for the person, for the kid, this is serious and my parents really want to have a conversation about this with me. I said this yesterday or on Sunday. I'll say it again quickly. It's not black and white. I do think there's some room for kids to be kids and for kids to squirm and for kids to get up and use the bathroom and for kids to color and draw and even have a good time and laugh and poke and all of that. But when that marks them in their time in the gathering, I think that's when we need to pause and help them understand what's going on. And I think that goes for everybody. I mean, for the person who's 30 years old, who's constantly checking the sports score during the gathering, is their heart in the right place? Are they truly considering what Christ has done and all that he's accomplished? If not, it's okay to just stop and say, you know what, my heart's not been in the right spot. I need to examine it and consider what Christ has done, or I need to remember that Christ has forgiven me, but I'm not going to take the communion this week.
So tell me what this dying and sickness is about.
Yeah, because if you do, you might die. So watch out. My take on it is that it was contextual. And I have a few reasons. It was based on the context that Paul was writing to.
So cultural? Not cultural, just Corinth.
Just specific to Corinth and what he knew of Corinth. And here's why I take it that way. The very next verse 30 of what we've been talking about, he said, this is why many of you are weak and ill and some have died. So that's really specific. He says, this is why many of you are weak and ill and some have died. He's not just guessing. That seems very specific, because then he goes on in verse 32, where he says, but when we are judged by the Lord, we're disciplined so that we may not be condemned along with the world. So he's bringing that, hey, this is what's going on. He's making the connection, I think, from afar, from what he's heard. This is my wording, so don't hold me to this. It's almost as if Paul is saying, hey, I wonder if this is the reason why you've seen a lot of sickness and death among you, that God's bringing discipline to you to wake you all up to what's going on in the church. So it's not a prediction for the church universal for all time. Hey, if you take the Lord's Supper in a wrong way, you're going to die. It's an observation of what he's experienced in the Corinthian church from afar and what's happened. And he's tying to that. That's the Lord's discipline on you. So it's time to wake up and see that this is wrong.
So it was an example of God's specific discipline for the church in Corinth.
Yep.
Which leaves open the possibility he could still discipline us that way also, or another way. But if he does bring discipline, really either one is a grace to us.
Yep.
Because of how we're behaving around the Lord's Supper.
Yeah. I think anything that I think God may use anything to wake us up to the ways in which we're not focused on who he is and what he's accomplished. And I think there are times when we ought to see the things in our lives as God doing that very thing. But often we're like, I don't know why why my ear has been clogged for almost 2 months now. That's interesting, isn't it? but maybe I ought to consider, is there something in my life God's trying to teach me right now through this?
Would it be fair to say that, to try to sum up this at times complicated passage, that to take communion in a worthy manner is to focus upon the person and work of Jesus?
Yes.
To take it in an unworthy manner is to not focus upon the person and work of Jesus and yet still take communion.
Yep. Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I think it is that simple, and lots of nuances in there, and lots of examples of how that can work out. But I do think it's that simple. He's asking the Corinthian church to consider what Christ has done, which is why I think he drops right in the middle of that Christ's words about what he's done, and then comes back to it. It's because of this. This is what we're talking about. It's that serious.
Okay, so I want to talk about some practical changes that we made.
Yep.
Based on this passage. We actually, Vince, I know you have some deep opinions and convictions here. Briefly talk that through, especially for those who are listening who did not join us yesterday.
Yeah. So we have made some changes. We have moved to unleavened bread for a couple reasons. Some of those reasons I think are given to us as instructions, and others are more of examples that may help with the symbolism. So I'll start with that. It was almost certain that Jesus and the disciples and everyone else who had, it was certain that the people who were celebrating the Passover were using unleavened bread, because the bread that the Israelites used in Egypt, commanded by God, was unleavened. They were instructed not to put a leavening agent in the bread, so they wouldn't have to wait for the bread to rise to bake it. They needed to be ready to go immediately when the angel of death passed over and they were released. And so a part of their taking the unleavened bread was during the Passover was very specific to that. That's certainly what Jesus is using. Even in, this is me reading into it, but even the wording, Jesus broke the bread. I've never had a soft loaf of bread that I have said, oh, I've broken the bread. You slice it or you tear it. You don't break it. Whereas an unleavened bread, a more hard, crackery kind of bread, is broken. So some of it is instruction. Some of it is more a tie to the symbolism of what Jesus is asking or communicating. There's also a tie throughout the New Testament, and Paul uses this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 of leaven equaling sin, and unleaven, or the leaven being removed, is the sin being removed. He talks about that with remove the sin from among you, remove the person from among you who's head over heels into sin. So he uses that leaven, unleaven as to mention sin and not sin. And Paul even says that the church is the unleavened bread. You are the unleavened bread. And so there's a tie to sin as well. Overall, that picture is to point us to a release from slavery to sin. So there's this freedom. There's a clear tie to that. So we've moved from the bread that we used to have to it is gluten-free. So Carrie and Jen worked hard to find a gluten-free, unleavened sort of matzah bread that has already been broken. It's broken in the trays for us. So that's one move. The other move we made is to move to individual cups in trays. Like if you grew up in the church, these are the gold or silver trays that were passed by you. We've moved to those for the reason, and this is more symbolic. This isn't an instruction necessarily. It's a description, not a prescription. That we see Jesus saying, "Take this, take the cup." And the bread, eat and drink in remembrance of me. And so the way we have been doing it through the dipping of bread, the intinction is what it's called, the dipping of bread in the wine or the grape juice, that's not a drinking, it's a tasting. And I still think we were able to remember what Christ has done through that. I don't think we were in sin, but I do think a more closely tied picture of what Christ is asking us to do is through the drinking of a cup. So unleavened bread, small cups that we take with us is a change that we've made. So
more symbolism involved in what we've done.
Yep. And I think it ties us back to what Christ, I think you can more clearly visualize yourself being in that room when Jesus says, I've broken this bread for you, take this cup. Like there's a more direct tie to the symbolism, the picture of what Christ is doing.
So we're still coming up to tables. There are different tables now. We're still being served. There's just no more dipping.
Yep.
There's still grape juice. There's still wine available.
Yep.
So one question that I think you got yesterday is why don't we then wait to take all of that together? Is that not what Paul is getting at in this chapter was the question?
Sure.
Or is that something different?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that this is my perspective after studying, and also I think some practicalities of the way in which we can do this. And many, you've probably been in church settings where you take the elements or they're passed by you. You take the bread and the wine or the grape juice, and you hold them and wait for the pastor to say some blessing or say something, and then everyone eats together, and you hear that stereo crunching of bread all around you,
and the cups going,
the cups going in the little holders in the pew in front of you. Yeah, so you hear that, and I think many have tied that to what Paul is saying, getting at that you wait for one another. He says in this passage. Which is a way to take it. And I think there can be some beauty in that. There can be some beauty in like, hey, as a church, we're doing this together. And it does signify unity. I don't think that's the instruction Paul's giving, though. While there is some beauty in it, and it could be beautiful to do it that way, I don't think that's what Paul's getting at. He's talking about the meal around the Lord's Supper, and how that has created a sense of elitism because some are able to be there and some are not because of just their work and life schedules. And so the wealthy people are able to be there. Some are the people who are not of means are not able to be there, and it's creating a division among them. Therefore, why don't you wait? So that's what Paul's getting at. He's not getting at everybody must chomp on the bread at the same time. So that's my take on it. Now, so the practical side of it, if Paul is saying there is a command, examine yourself, I think the way we currently do it, and I'm open to discussion here, and we haven't really talked about this part as elders. I had this question yesterday, and we'll talk about that in our next elders meeting, about how we do it. My take on it is if we're called to examine ourselves, that may take different people different time to do that. And I want to create the space for individuals to have that time. I also want to create the space for, I've seen it now, we do this as a family too. We circle up as a family and we pray over the bread and the wine together as a family. It's become a sweet time for us as a family, and I've seen other families doing it, other friends circling up to do that as well. So it gives that space and time as well to really examine our hearts and consider what Christ has done. So I don't think, all in all, here's the summary. I don't think Paul is commanding us, giving us the instruction that you must eat the bread at the same time and you must drink the wine at the same time. It's about something totally different. It's about the people loving one another in such a way that wait. So the way that I would relate that to our gatherings now is if we just never publish the time that we start, and we just start whenever the important people get there. So maybe the important people from our perspective get there at 8:15 and we just go ahead and start the gathering. That I think Paul would come in and say, what are you doing? Why don't you wait? Wait for the people to be here and be a part of what you're doing.
Just to speak to gathering as a family, when we do take communion, like it's a really neat opportunity as a parent just to shepherd your kids through that. And so Vince and I will take turns praying, but I'll also ask our boys to pray sometimes before we take communion. And it's actually a really sweet time to kind of hear from them through their prayer what they took from the sermon and what the Lord is working on in their heart in that moment. And so just an encouragement to parents, like if you are taking communion with your kids, like use it as an opportunity to shepherd and use it as an opportunity to help them begin to understand what it is to pray out loud and what it is to pray as a family and taking communion together. Like every single thing like that can turn into a shepherding moment. And it's also helped my boys just grow in listening because they know mom may call on them and ask them to pray, but not in a stressful way. But I think we can see these moments as shepherding as parents.
Yeah, I would even say for parents who are taking communion and their kids are not yet in a spot, in a place in their lives where they are taking the elements, the Lord's Supper for themselves, to even circle up with them and to have an opportunity to communicate. This represents the body of Christ. This represents the blood of Christ. We're remembering what he's done. That's why we're doing this. I think that's a sweet moment as a family to even shepherd young children through that and teach them about that.
Yeah, so tell me for you personally, how do you normally prepare or examine yourself for communion? Do you have a regular rhythm that you do every week? Does it vary week to week? What does that look like for you personally?
I think for me, it varies week to week. It's often what in the sermon do I feel like the Spirit is convicting me of? And are there areas that I need to spend some time confessing? I think a piece that I've been trying to focus more on recently, which sounds ridiculous, but just spending some time praying and thanking Jesus for his sacrifice. Like, I think that's what I felt this sense of conviction of, is the number of times that I've taken communion because it's just what we do, but not really taking time to consider the sacrifice of Christ, and thanking him for that. And so trying to, I hate the word discipline because I don't want to be disciplined in thanking Jesus for his sacrifice, but turning it into a discipline of every week, making sure that expressing gratitude for his sacrifice is part of the preparation of my heart.
Vince, Betty, what do you do?
I mean, it's definitely changed throughout the years. When I think about growing up, it was something for me that I never really heard or maybe processed how, like, just like really what communion is and like why it's important. And I think it was just kind of like a regular rhythm for me. And I think it's been growing to, take time to really kind of evaluate my own heart. I mean, a lot of it's very similar to what Kirsten was just saying, like things that hit in the sermon that I feel like come to mind. And I think there was season 2 similarly where it would just become a spiral beforehand of just like thinking of sin and like my own sin and not even considering like why we are celebrating communion, and that is about Christ and what he has done for us. And so I think trying intentionally to now also reflect upon that and thank God for that. So a lot of it is very similar to what you were saying, Kirsten, and a lot of it is because I would just kind of miss the mark and think a lot about myself and my own sin, and then just feel kind of bad for a while and not really consider the reality of why we're able to celebrate with one another.
Well, and the reality that all those sins that you're feeling bad about are like, they're covered by the blood of Christ. And so the irony that we would step into communion and feel bad about those things to the point that we would be distracted from taking communion. It's very ironic that the enemy can infiltrate there. But the reality is that like all of those things are covered by the blood of Christ. And so working from a place of gratitude of, yes, confessing these things, but also like knowing that our standing before Christ hasn't changed because of any of these things, because of his sacrifice.
So at least 2 ditches to avoid, right, in approaching the table. One is take it in a cavalier manner, which we've talked a lot about. But the other one, you just mentioned, Betty, is to allow your sin to paralyze you from taking it as if you have to like work up a worthiness or something in order to take it in the first place. So 2 ditches to avoid. Vince, what's your, and usually you're just coming off of preaching, so I wonder if it's a different battle for you.
Yeah, and I think I've communicated this before, that often, it's just become my rhythm of prayer as I come off from preaching, that I often come and sit down, and one of the first things I do, I've sort of trained my head and my heart to do, is to just repetitively pray, help me to believe this is not about me. Because that's a place where the enemy's at work right away. What are you doing? That was useless. That was a waste of time. So I have to pray this is not about me. It doesn't, those things are untrue, or the other way around. Hey, this is about me. Look at what I did. That was really good. So I have to just consistently pray this is not about me. So from there I turn to, this is not about me. This is actually about Christ and what he's accomplished. And then it becomes a prayer of, would those things become true for me and for the people who just heard the word taught? So that's repetitive. That's every single week. That's coming to my heart and mind.
Yeah. So there's some freedom here in how you examine yourself, but also some common principles as well.
What about you, Eric? What's that rhythm look like for
He was
you?
trying to get out of it.
Yeah.
He's the host. He doesn't have to answer.
Yeah. Usually I try to listen to the Spirit on what he may be bringing to mind based on the sermon. Sin to confess, or I don't know, maybe it's something about God that I get to rejoice in. But often it's hard. It's hard to stay focused at that point in the semi-quiet of the place to be able to listen. So usually my mind goes in and out. I try to listen for a little bit and I get distracted with what my kids are doing. I try to listen again or confess or prepare to recognize what we're about to do, and then I get distracted by something else. So that's often my experience anyway. Something in that realm. I want to ask one more question before we talk about our last question here. So Paul starts this passage by saying that he does not commend the Corinthian church in how they're approaching communion. That's based, from what you shared, Vince, on a deeper elitism, those kind of classes, which is based on you're not loving each other well, right? This doesn't become about Jesus and loving each other anymore. What might be things that in our gatherings that could be distracting us from Jesus today? So hopefully it's not communion. We don't have not quite the same setting, but are there things that could be distracting us from Jesus and how we go about things today?
I think it's a good question to consider. I won't answer the question yet. I'd love to hear from you all, but I do think there are some factors to that. I think of C.S. Lewis's book, The Screw Tape Letters, and there are a lot. There's this interaction between the uncle demon and the nephew demon, and how the nephew demon gets discouraged by this or that thing, and the older demon says, "Oh no, this is exactly where we want them. Make sure that the person sitting next to them is singing out of key. That will be a distraction, and make sure that the person with the hair that's out of style is a distraction." And so I think a lot of these things can be heart postures that would pull us away from seeing more of Jesus. So maybe you didn't get a good parking spot, and on the way in your kid threw a fit, and so you're already stepping into the gathering with a heart that's inclined towards self or towards something else. So I think it could anyway, without answering the question, I'll say that I think it's a heart posture that could be a variety of things.
I mean, a few things that came to mind that have been struggles for me are just based on preferences, that maybe the worship wasn't what I wanted it to be, or there was some distraction there. I think when my kids were younger, I often felt deeply distracted because I was having to parent a lot. And I think I had to change my heart posture there, and understanding that for a season when my kids were younger, my maybe role in church changed from one that was going to just receive, as far as like during the teaching and stuff like that, to one who was there to help my children eventually reach a point that they could learn to receive. And so, and I think understanding that, I think I had a season where I felt some frustration, especially when my kids were young and we were planting the church, and like I was getting 5 kids by myself to church and having to sit in a pew and parent 5 real squirrely little boys while Vince was preaching. Like I felt really alone and really frustrated because I could hardly even listen to what he was saying because I was constantly redirecting somebody. But recognizing that my role in that season probably was different than what I had hoped it would be, and there's still value in that. And so I think there's a surrender that has to come with whatever season you're in, of knowing that being there's value, even if you're not able to sit and listen like you normally would. But I think a lot of times when you've got little kids, that can be very distracting, especially in our church where we've got children's ministry every other week for ages 5 and up. That can feel hard for parents to come and pay attention, but recognizing that your role there when your kids are in the service with you is extremely important, and they're getting to watch you worship, and they're getting to watch you sit under the teaching of God's word, and you're getting to worship with your kids. So the distraction is part of the role that you have.
Were you asking like specifically about things that we do as a church that could be a distraction, or like things for ourselves that could be distractions, or both?
Either are certainly valid, but I was thinking specifically, like, are there things that we do as a church that could be a distraction? Maybe not.
No, we do nothing that's a distraction. Everything is well-oiled and on point.
But maybe to put a little bit of a finer point on, there are things that we do that might feel a bit more auxiliary.
Sure.
Right.
Can you think of an example?
We talked about coffee earlier.
Yeah.
It's a piece of hospitality. Does it point to Jesus? Well, maybe make an argument that we're being hospitable, but it's not a direct line.
Sure.
Like our liturgy is.
Yeah.
Or what also came to mind was at some point we want to buy air conditioning for our sanctuary, but does air conditioning point directly to Jesus? Well, there's a hospitality piece, and when it's really hot, that can certainly be distracting.
Can point us to hell.
Yeah.
It's hotter than.
But somebody else could also make the argument that, yeah, that's a lot of money that we could, put someplace else.
Missions, right, Richard?
Yeah, that's right. So maybe that is more of the hot topic, so to speak. Things that might feel auxiliary.
Yeah.
But maybe not directly distracting.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe if our listener has any ideas of things that we do that are directly distracting from Jesus being the focus, I'd love to hear it.
Oh, absolutely. If there are things, nothing, first of all, I'll say this. I do not think we do everything perfectly.
Right.
However, I do think as we've looked at what we do on a Sunday morning, our hope and intent is to point all the attention to Jesus. Now, there may be things that we miss. There may be things that we tried, but we didn't actually get there. So that may be true. So I'm not saying that, no, we've done it, but that has been our hope. I mean, it's been our hope to be very intentional through everything that we do in the gathering itself. Now, could we do greeting better? Maybe. Could our parking be better? Could our, coffee and all of those things, could all of that change and be taken away or better or whatever? Yeah, of course. But I think in our gathering, as much as we're able, we've tried really hard to point all of the attention to Jesus. So, to our listener, if there are things during our gathering that you have seen are real distractions from that, we would love to hear it. Eric would love to hear it. Eric at thetownchurch.org, and he will take care of it immediately.
I imagine that one of them could be having kids in our gathering. And that's something we've thought long and hard about, made a very intentional decision with to invite, and we love having kids in there. And kids at times will be kids, and not only distracting to the parents, like Kirsten, you had mentioned that, but maybe also the people around them. Mm-hmm. But we also see enough value in that to push through that. So I could see that maybe as an example. One that I've heard before in the Big C church are like the pastor who's preaching. If the illustrations are all about himself or that sort of thing, that can be a way that becomes about somebody or something else different. Worship's the same way. Like the music portion.
Or even the sermons in that way, that they give you some good tips about life, but are not grounded in who Jesus is and what he's already accomplished. Mm-hmm. And we've probably all experienced sermons like that, or churches where we've experienced that. And we may be that church at times, and that needs to have correction as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a live issue today, I think.
I think the skinny bottom coffee cups that tip
over
every week, and then somebody runs to the back to get paper towels. Like, I think every person in our church has had that experience personally. So I'm not, me included, so I'm not pointing anybody out, but I'm like, that is a little bit of a distraction. So we just need fat bottom mugs that don't tip so easily.
It's such a distinct sound, too.
I know.
I hear the cups tipping over right now.
When you hear the clink,
and then you wait
see
for the
somebody
person to
walk
stand
in.
I know what they're doing.
Those cheap IKEA mugs, they've served us well, but they are wobbly.
They are.
I do think this is super, super surfacey and practical. I do think the changes we've made to communion actually eliminates some of the distraction of the bread that didn't taste good and the floaters that you had to dip your fingers into.
And then the wine drip trail.
And then the Clorox wipes that the communion servers would use to mop up I know that's silly and surfacey, but there are some distractions that were pulled away from that.
Yeah.
There we go.
All right. I have other thoughts, so I'm going to stop. All right. So let's do this last question. What does this passage show you about who God is? What's God like according to this text?
I think the thing that stood out to me is that from Paul writing the inspired words of God, he gives some pretty harsh corrections and warnings about the seriousness of what we're gathering to do. This is not an insignificant thing that we do on Sunday mornings. And just a little aside, I think sometimes we take it as an insignificant thing. It's not a big deal if I'm there or not.
At the gathering?
Yeah, it's not a big deal if I'm there or not, or I don't know, I've missed this many times or whatever. It's not a big deal. It's something I'll get to if I can. Anyway, we have a God who desires our worship, desires our involvement in community, desires unity around the right things, around Christ and Christ crucified, so much that he gave us his word that's pretty straightforward about how we are to do some of these things.
I mean, I'd say similarly, I think God cares deeply about his worship and how we worship him. And I think I don't always take that into consideration, that my heart coming into worship matters to God. And it's not just something that we're doing because it's rote and routine, but there's actually something powerful in being present with God's people and worshiping God together. And God is glorified in that, and he cares about the order in which that's done.
I really appreciated just the reality that this is intentionally designed to point us so much to Christ. I think the big points of yesterday, that how it unites us in Jesus and it's from Jesus and it reveals our need for Jesus that's been fulfilled in him. I think we're all just really humbling reminders for me of this is why this exists, is because of Christ, and to point us to Christ and unify us in him and remind us like that we do deeply need him and that need is fulfilled through him.
Yeah, you see God's grace through all of it. We're invited in to celebrate a meal that remembers God's grace through Jesus. And at the same time, we see God's holiness. He cares, just like you all have said, how this is done and to not be cavalier. So a gracious and also holy God. All right, what's next? Next passage.
Yeah, if you've made it this far listening to this podcast, next week.
Which you probably have not.
Chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. Now, can I give a quick plug or endorsement or something here?
Yeah.
Disclaimer. We're about to step into some interesting lists of ways in which the Spirit has been given to each believer, and the ways that those gifts then that the Spirit has given are displayed. And remember, these instructions are from Paul to the church, for the church, in the gathering of the church. And I know all of us come from different backgrounds and different settings and different ways that we've experienced that. And I would encourage each of us to come with as much open-mindedness as we're able to do, and see what God's word has for us in this as we learn together. And while some of us have to shake off some of our baggage, or some of us may have to learn from some of the things that are here, I want us to step into this with open eyes to be unified together. So chapter 12, verses 1 through 11 this week. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions, and we'll see where it goes.
Well, thanks for listening if you made it.
Yeah.
See ya.